In the video today, I wanted to go through one aspect of Faustian society, which is the Verein. This is a German term which is utilized in English in separate ways for separate notions. I think a good way to conceptualize this, though, is through the notion of a club or a union. These are two very important concepts in Faustian society and in the broader Faustian mindset around belonging, comradeship, things around a drive collectively towards some type of action. Historically, we can perceive it such as a free or oath-bound association for different reasoning, different types. The very basic form, I think, can hopefully visualize this for you a bit better, is to understand the Viking ship, where you have a captain and his herdmen, free men who had come together and bound for a venture with a certain mission, a scope, cynosure. And opposite to this was the idea of something like the Teutonic order, which was an order of knights with no specific, say, purpose or remit, but other than we're established for the reasons here, and this is how we'll uphold what we value as our ideals. So in these two, you want to call them geists or visages, we get this idea of a Verein, or a club and a union. And this is how we can start to think of it from a dyadic perspective of what you belong to and why informs both the nature of the association, but also its purpose, and that's political purpose here. We can think of a club as being something invented primarily, albeit it was the Turner Club was a gymnastics club invented in Germany, but the idea that the club is something that the Englishman, the English gentleman in particular, was very fond of it and obviously had a long time perfecting and garnering a lot of support for amongst the other genteel types. And morphologically, we can think of this as this leisure, this carousing effect, where we bring together like-minded men of their own free volition to partake in a certain type of activity. And this is how you get this idea of a club. It's this leisurely coming together collaboration. And so you have a rugby club, you have a hunting club, you can have a cricket club, you can have a boxing club, all these old school gentlemanly ideals around associating by free will. This is why it's very English, it's very Anglo in that sense. And then on the opposite end, you have this idea of a union, and this we can think much more of as being, say, combat focused, where we have what are intent towards a continuation of politics via other means, which is usually war, combat, battle, things like this, but also politics in general is much more affected by the idea of a union, and this also goes into labor unions, workers' unions, things like this. I'll just quickly show you here that the idea of an outfit or of the certain style of, you almost don't want to call it armor necessarily, but garment or arraignment, where you have this picturesque ideal of the certain belonging to the group. And in sports, it's obviously easy to understand as a kit. So like a sporting kit, you'll have the matching everything so that your whole consensus of belonging, collaboration, and cooperation are also borne out in the way that you're representing, in the way that your physiognomy and your morphology is. And then on the opposite end is the almost individuality of what is a common leitmotif amongst the certain things, but each knight will have a distinct mien and garments, so that you'll have what is collectively a very both matching but also unique stylistic representation. And this you can also see borne out in something like Sherlock Holmes or Bismarck over here, where there's this very distinct Prussian element to this. And speaking of the Prussian element, it's something maybe worth speaking toward directly with Oswald Spengler here in his long treatise called Prussianism and Socialism. And he goes on to say that there is not and cannot be a German or Prussian type of society like the English. A society made up of separate egos, lacking the unifying pathos of a common purpose and goal, always strikes us as somewhat ridiculous. In imitation of the English club and banquet, our German individualists and liberals have invented the Verein and the Festessen. These are his devices for the development of cultural solidarity. And what Spengler obviously takes say affront here with is the notion that the German can be like the Englishman. And this isn't to say there can't be Germans who are very English and Englishmen who are very German. It's to say the national spirit of a Teutonic knight can never be the Anglo-Viking. And this is borne out in something like the agreed upon arrangement for a German or an English gathering. So the English tend to gather in what were called private clubs. There's this free association of a man towards his social grouping. Usually it's either a alumni of a certain university or school, or it's a type of vocation that he may have had, particularly something like the army, the navy. You have a private club associated to that, or in general maybe it was a gambler's den where you have a proclivity for a certain type of affairs. But in general there is this idea of a gentleman's club, and in Germany you have much more contrast to that, the beer hall, where you can see much more the egalitarian nature of everyone sitting. And this is where Spengler goes into his socialism idea. It's that men are equal in the way that it's bound conceptually with who they are as a Teutonic or Teutonic feeling, the knightly feeling, where we all sit around the round table, as Arthurian legend would have it. But you're in the beer hall equal to one another, whereas obviously in a gentleman's private club here, you are much more enclosed, and your dialogues are typically more private, concealed, one-on-one, with much less ability to eavesdrop, and you just have that privacy that's affected there. Further to this, Spengler, also in the same tract, goes on to say, but the Viking spirit and the communal spirit of the Teutonic Knights gradually gave rise to two antithetical ethical imperatives. One side bore the Germanic idea actively within itself, while the other felt itself subject to it. Personal independence on the one hand, and suprapersonal community spirit on the other. Today we refer to these concepts as individualism and socialism. Virtues of the most exalted kinds are summarized by these words. In the one case, personal responsibility, self-reliance, determination, and initiative. And in the other, loyalty, discipline, selflessness, and a sense of obligation. To be free and to serve. There is nothing more difficult than this. A people whose spirit and being are capable of it, a nation that can truly serve and be free, deserves to take upon itself a great destiny. And so you can see here the allusion to all of these elements and how they all conspire together to allow us to foresee how there'll be this different interpretation of a belonging, of a grouping. Both have dress codes, for instance, and you'll see that with the now anachronistic Prussian garb, or the Teutonic knightly garb, which has been supplanted by what is the genteel and English aristocratic, or gentleman even, outfit, which is typically found to be this tweed suit, which is now seen as the par excellence in terms of male dress codes. And with this, you have the domination of the Anglo and the Viking in particular of the Teutonic knight to a large degree. But in saying that, that's the idea is that once you've got a dress code, you've established a certain a priori requirements to be included into a club. The club's designation and its purpose has been defined, or the union has been defined. You have a lot of scheming, you have this politicization of all of these elements, and the Anglo will obviously scheme individually with one another, whereas the German is much more used to being able to socialize their schemes. On one, you have obviously much more conniving and conspiratorial, on the other you have a much more open and earnest conversation around practicalities, because once you have multiple voices that require being heard, it's much harder to designate certain surreptitious motives to things. And this is why English typically made the best spies, for instance, and the Germans made what we would consider the best brotherhoods in a lot of those ways, in warrior unions. Nevertheless, where you can go into why the club, let's say, is the epitome of that English feelings, that spirit, the Anglo-Viking spirit. It's what you would say is the coming together of the completely free spirit, as Spengler has said it, and this is epitomized at the moment in America. America has taken this to the ne plus ultra, you would say, of what's required of a club, is that it's commercialized. So Americans have taken what is ostensibly was at least a non-commercial affair, which is a club for men and later women to join to pursue a specific purpose, particularly sport, whereby once you've established this, then you can understand that people will want to come and spectate and support and barrack and do all these things, and necessarily that starts to attract money in certain ways. Now, typically, or like historically, that was done under the table in a lot of ways. You would employ men at clubs, particularly locally, such that they would continue to contribute and train for certain sports. But then obviously the professionalization era has twisted or expanded those motives to be much more dominated by the idea of money as the purpose. And this is very Viking. Obviously, this is very Faustian to that Viking treasure-seeking extent. So we take the logical conclusion, which is the commercialization of a club, and the clubs are now very large, multi-billion-dollar valued affairs, particularly in America, where you have, say, National Football League clubs being worth multiple billions, like the Dallas Cowboys or the Washington Redskins. And in doing this, you've naturally taken what is, I think, the conclusive affair of a club in the Viking spirit to beyond. And the last stop here is, if not private equity ownership, then an IPO. And you've seen many clubs, and this in English football or otherwise in other football leagues, the idea of an IPO for a club is that the share market can now bear the burden and the costs of running a professional club. And that, to me, is obviously a massive dilution of, say, the soul of a club. You start to understand the mercenary style sporting dispositions most people have, where it's, we'll just buy the best players regardless of where they're from. So AC Milan is no longer players from Milan. It's players from everywhere who play in the club just basically for money. There's no passion there that's necessarily attributed to or arrogated by the club. So that is definitely a degradation of the feeling. And then in the opposite affair, you have student unions. These are still running, where you have mensure and other sort of behaviors, quite strong obviously in England with, say, debate clubs and other sort of student unions, but also in the DACH region in what is Deutschland, where you have some of these other, as I say, more historical and private affair of unions, where there's still this, you could say, historical legacy of the aristocratic feeling. One, I guess, differentiator to this, and that can be borne out in historical fact, is the idea of the free man versus the oath-bound man. But in general, English behavior towards all of these things has always been commercial. So if you look at the armies historically, Prussian armies have never sold ratings or positions. So commissions were done only through, obviously, birthright, but also through, tenure or legacy admissions to certain levels. So you couldn't be a captain or a sergeant without the prerequisite contribution to the army in Prussia. But in England, if you were an officer and you wanted to buy your own commission, that all it would do is transfer it from someone else. They would sell their commission to you, and you could become a captain or a lieutenant or something like that, where you have this idea of the price you pay to be in lead of a troop, and that then you would establish what is certain requirements around providing for that position. If that was the horses, if you're in dragoons or in the hussars or something like this, or if you're just a standardized trooper or something, then you'll still need to pay for your kit and all of these things, because that's expected of an officer is usually money, and it's easier to buy commissions and go from there. So this is just one of those interesting, once again, separations and bifurcations of spirit. It's like there's an idea, a notion of virtue in the knight, and these things would be unheard of in someone who's committed to mind, body, and soul. The idea of defending Prussia versus the English idea of you can purchase commissions and sail around the world and go off on an adventure to hopefully earn that money back and then some. The last sort of point here is how you can contrast this with the other culture, the reflections in other European cultures, with the French, and they have their cafes or their, you could almost say orgies, their masquerade balls. These things are very French, no longer as passé, but in general, the French have their own very stylistic elements to how they congregate and what they discuss and how. And then the Spanish with their Catholic, say, cults, and there's usually a more religious aspect to the Spanish gathering and around how they conceive of ventures under the Pope or the Catholic guise. which I think is just very interesting to discuss. But all of them, as you can see, relate to politics, and war being a function of politics in that way. It's that there's always going to be a gathering of men, but it's very interesting how the choices have differed between the Viking aspect and the knightly notions of what should be and what is the modus operandi of a club or of a union, how we can think about your belonging to these things. So lastly, I think for you, it's to envision or imagine how it is you can derive your own status, how you feel when you join a club. Is it something where you want to, of course, be around like-minded people, around a certain idea? You have this ambit of why the club exists and a cynosure. But it's to say, if I wanted to be, and this is fairly easy in athletic terms, to be on a rugby team, I would want to be the best player. I want to be the captain. And a captain on a rugby team is once again structured very similarly to an army regiment, for instance, because that's the natural instinct of a leader, is to be at the top, decision making, but also leading from the front. And so this is the idea of the individual who is actually comprising just one part of the machine of this really effective fighting, and in this case, rugby playing machine. And the philosophical disposition each order or club has towards leadership is also very telling. So if you think of those unions, those student unions, particularly in Deutschland, where you have the idea that men are ranked and hierarchically judged by certain metrics around certain things, the idea of a Prussian student union would be based much more around this martial prowess and the idea that the president and the secretary and the treasurer and all of these positions are highly regarded for certain reasons. But in the Anglo club, it's much more, particularly nowadays, around what they call merit, or around electability, for instance. So a lot of English clubs will just have women in certain positions because that's who volunteered and that's who's said to be best to manage those positions. So anything from your lacrosse or your polo or your cricket club could have anyone and anybody in any of these positions, and usually that's more on, say, merit rather than as a necessary respect or a adulation around the status type of ranking and hierarchy, which I just find very fascinating. So the next time you think about clubs and unions, think about how they make you feel and what exactly it is you derive out of those in terms of purpose and being and belonging, because it is a very important part of the Faustian mindset to attach yourself to these things as not just ideas, but as actions and as hopefully rewards for you.